Officials now say 7 people have been killed by the outbreak of E. coli in Walkerton, Ontario, and they warn it could be as many as 9.
In May of 2000, the small community of Walkerton, Ontario, was hit by a mysterious illness, where a large number of residents suddenly reported cases of bloody diarrhea, vomiting, cramps, and fever. Over the next few weeks, 2,300 of the town's 5,000 residents would fall ill, and 7 would die. Not even a month later, government officials identified the source of the illness as contaminated water in the community, stemming from E. coli bacteria that had seeped into the well water system from cattle manure at a nearby farm. A criminal investigation was ordered to find out how this happened. It was quickly discovered that Walkerton Public Utilities Commission operators, brothers Stan and Frank Kobel, had been aware of E. coli contamination in the water from earlier routine lab tests, but did not notify public health officials. Further inquiry revealed that the 2 brothers were not qualified to hold the positions and were uninformed about water safety. Stan was sentenced to 1 year of jail and Frank to 9 months of house arrest. 8 months later, in February of 2001, all Walkerton residents were offered $2,000 compensation from the Ontario government to settle a class action lawsuit. Those who fell seriously ill or had relatives die would also be eligible for more money, as well as anyone suffering from serious long-term health problems from the water contamination. An intensive public inquiry was also conducted, identifying the multiple contributing causes that led to this tragic situation, in addition to negligence of water operators. These included the condition of the well system, which was too shallow and too near manure runoff, and the fact that the well was not chlorinated properly. So we have a pretty good idea of what happened, why it happened, and how to make sure that it never happens again. This was a tragedy that shocked the country. How could a country like Canada have drinking water that was unsafe for its citizens to drink? Today, Walkerton has very safe water to drink. It's home to the Walkerton Clean Water Centre, a service agency providing training to water system owners, operators, operating authorities, and the public. So why hasn't such swift and decisive action been taken to tackle the unsafe drinking water among countless First Nations communities across Canada over the years? Most of these drinking water advisories had been in effect for years, usually decades, a lot of them since the 1990s. So when the water isn't safe to drink, you have to boil water, you have to buy bottled water, because the water coming out of your tap isn't safe. So you can see the parallels to Walkerton. Why was action taken in a matter of weeks there? Well, if you're living in a First Nations community, you can go 20, 30 years without safe water. Would that make you feel like you were valued by Canada? The good news is that since 2015, 145 of these advisories have been lifted, and the government has deemed the water safe to drink. The bad news is that as of making this video, 31 of these advisories are still in effect. One of them, in Neskantaga First Nation, has had a drinking water advisory since 1995, and it still hasn't been lifted, meaning they haven't had safe drinking water for 29 years. Others include Shoal Lake in Ontario, which had an advisory from 1997 to 2021, 24 years. Nazco in British Columbia from 1999 to 2015, 16 years. Sedeldale, British Columbia, 1999 to 2018, 17 years. And Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe, Quebec, 1999 to 2017, 18 years. And the list goes on and on and on. So this video is about water contamination, but also environmental contamination in a broader sense. It's about health, racism, colonization, and a lot of other things too. This video is about Grassy Narrows, a small Anishinaabe community in northwestern Ontario. As of October 2023, it had a population of about 1,600 people. Also, this video is a bit about the community of White Dog First Nation, but mostly it's about Grassy Narrows.
A community ruined by mercury.
We couldn't eat off the land anymore the way we used to. It was poison.
Disturbing new science.
Mercury is still higher than guidelines suggest it should be.
A settlement fund in trouble.
Some people applied for appeal 3 or 4 times maybe.
Then the mercury hit.
Welcome back to APTN Investigates as we begin our new season tonight.
Grassy Narrows is one of 28 First Nations within the Grand Council Anishinaabe Nation and Treaty No. 3 territory. Side note, I'll probably explain a bit more about treaties in another video, but if you do want to know your treaty territory, nativeland.ca is a great resource. If you look at this region of Canada on a map, you'll notice it's all just waters, rivers, lakes, islands, all from glaciers carving out this area thousands of years ago. So, going back to the theme of water, Grassy Narrows is on the Wabigoon River system. It's a vast river system with a lot of lakes and tributaries, and eventually everything flows west into the Winnipeg River. 62 kilometers upstream from Grassy Narrows is a town called Dryden, currently at a population of about 8,000 people. And you'll notice White Dog is also on the same river system, just a bit farther away. And there's also a town called Reddit, lol. Dryden is home to a pulp and paper mill, which sits on Wabigoon Lake, and that lake is the headwaters of the Wabigoon River. The Dryden pulp and paper mill has gone through a lot of names, and it's owned by a lot of different companies over the years, international corporations, that sort of thing. It's changed hands a lot, but in the 1960s, the pulp and paper mill was owned by a British multinational corporation called Reed International. In 1970, the Canadian federal government and the Ontario provincial government noticed through routine monitoring that there were extremely high levels of mercury in predatory fish from the Wabigoon River system.
In 1970, the Ontario government issued a warning against eating fish from the English Wabigoon River system because the fish were contaminated with mercury.
They saw this as a big problem, mostly because the region is known for great fishing and had a pretty successful commercial fishing and tourism industry. Due to the unsafe levels of mercury found in the fish, all commercial and sport fishing in the Wabigoon River below Dryden was closed, with the ban later extended to many other lakes in the area. The Ontario Minister of Energy and Resource Management, George Albert Kerr, reassured the local community that the Wabigoon River would recover naturally within 12 weeks, without government intervention or cleanup. Okay, problem solved. End of episode. The government fixed it. Done. Ha, what a funny joke.
Nice execution.
You're doing terrific.
So you might be wondering, okay, that's nice that they stopped all the white fishing tourists from eating contaminated fish, but what about the communities of Grassy Narrows and White Dog, which are also located on the Wabigoon River system and whose residents presumably eat a lot of fish daily as part of their diet? And to that I would say, yes, you are right to worry about that, and you are also probably more knowledgeable and or compassionate than a lot of Canadian politicians in the 1970s.
This one's to end racism.
Also later, Minister George Kerr revealed that he absolutely made up the estimate of 12 weeks, saying that if he had said 1 to 2 years, they probably would have never believed me. And apparently that was met with laughter in the Ontario Parliament because these things are just so funny when they don't affect you. Yes, Ontario Parliament, still a clown show 50 years later.
Oh, hi, thanks for checking in. I'm still a piece of garbage.
But let's back up a bit and let's learn a bit more about Grassy Narrows in particular. So the community is located near Clay Lake. This is the first major downstream lake in the Wabigoon River system, and that is significant because, as we'll later find out, a lot of the mercury discharge into the system tended to collect and accumulate in Clay Lake. But putting on my social science hat to get more of the history of the people of Grassy Narrows, I read a book called A Poison Stronger Than Love by Dr. Anastasia Shkilnik, and it was published in 1985, And Dr. Skilnick was an anthropologist who had been sent to Grassy Narrows by the Canadian government to help find solutions to the economic and social issues that were disrupting the community. Dr. Skilnick lived in Grassy Narrows for 2 years as a community planner, and the book documents her experiences, and it's actually an adapted version of her doctoral thesis. But as part of the book, she does offer a bit of the oral history of the community that was shared with her, and that was really interesting to read. So we learn that the community of Grassy Narrows traditionally lived on kind of the group of islands and peninsulas in the region. This territory was allocated out to them by the Northwest Anglo Treaty of 1873. And in this region, the fishing was good, and they didn't really have any issues traveling everywhere by canoe. Contact outside of the community was rather limited, with residents following a more traditional subsistence lifestyle.
Treaty 3 was ratified between the Crown and the Soto Indians, including Grassy Narrows, in 1873. It states, Indians shall have the right to pursue their avocations of hunting and fishing throughout the tract surrendered. However, it also states, excepting such tracts as may from time to time be required or taken up for settlement, mining, lumbering, or other purposes by her said government of the Dominion of Canada.
There is different versions of the treaty. There's the version that's published by Canada, which you can find in your local library. There was a version that was kept by the Manitoban, which was a newspaper at the time. One of the negotiators, Dawson, kept notes. A French guy named Nolan kept notes. And then one of the chiefs had somebody keep notes for him called the Pay Palm Treaty. And then, of course, there's the oral recollections of the native people that were there, which has been passed on through the years. There's within that document, Treaty 3 is published by Canada. You'll see in there it's very specific that it says that the Anishinaabe people cede, release, yield up, surrender all rights, titles, privileges. And when you examine that document, you can see very clearly on the bottom that there are the signatures of our people on there. So there is legitimacy to their point of view that they can make some argument that we did surrender those things. However, those other source documents say that there are different understandings of the treaty, and in recent Supreme Court cases, the Supreme Court has been saying that those oral traditions, those oral understandings of the treaties are equal to what that written document is.
My great-great-great-grandfather was one of the signers of the treaty. It's been, passed on, to my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother. All have said that this land was never surrendered, as it's written in the treaty that we surrendered it. And my elders say that they never gave up the land; they agreed to share the land.
The elders' understanding of the treaty is that there was enough goodness in this country for everybody to live a good life, and that we would share those. And the other understanding was that we would keep our way of life along with the economic base, and they would keep their way of life. It was never intended for who in their right mind would give up their way of feeding themselves and agree to give up their way of life.
You can keep your way of life. I mean, that's one of the most consistent treaty promises made, both in the Treaty 3 context and in many of the treaty contexts. We're not having you sign this treaty in order for you to, get rid of your way of life. And the way of life of the Anishinaabe people in Treaty 3 territory is a hunting and fishing and trapping way of life. So I would say that means that although the Crown has the right to use the Crown land, to settle it, to develop it, I don't believe it can do so in a way that makes the hunting, fishing, and trapping way of life impossible. It can't clear-cut all of the forests. And the treaty is protected by the Constitution. It's the highest law of the land, and it's the founding law.
But in 1963, the Canadian government relocated the community of Grassy Narrows to a new reserve that was more easily accessible by road from Kenora. It is about 5 miles south of where they used to live. And the rationale for this was that it would be easier to provide people with things like school, electricity, and improved housing and social services. But this move also negatively impacted the traditional hunting and trapping practices because they were in a more permanently settled community. And also, I guess the government decided that treaties don't matter anymore when they're inconvenient for them. Don't worry, I'm sure this will never happen again. Anyway, so the community was resettled, which would obviously be a bit of a shock to say the least. And then 7 years later, in 1970, they discovered that their river was poisoned with mercury.
Our connection was always with the land because that was our way of survival. Was a good life. If one had to praise it, it was like part of our religion. I'd say that the whole community is affected by it.
Steve Fobister Sr. fondly remembers growing up here. Treaty 3 territory. The land and water surrounding Grassy Narrows First Nation.
Everything that we owned, hid in a canoe and all, we went. The values of our connection with the Creator, with the land. It was the provider for everything, our mental and emotional and physical likeness, and it fed us well.
That was before mercury poisoning, before government and industry turned lives upside down. That's when the social problems all started. It was 1965 when his family of 10 was told they had to live on the reserve. Out of the path of progress. He was 12.
We knew that this was coming, and they talked about it. We would have an industrial invasion, and we had to give up our way of life so people can have jobs. I think that's the beginning of the end. Things were just moving too fast for us people, and we had to grow up, very fast.
Relocation started in 1963.
They got relocated here because there was a road in from Kenora, Supplies would be more accessible and the hydro.
In 1970, soon after the relocation, mercury contamination was identified. Commercial fishing was wiped out. They also lost their primary source of food, fish.
Little did they know there was even worse in store.
Before we got to that point, to settle all this new way of life, then the mercury hit, and that's just like the last nail in the coffin.
This pulp mill poisoned Fobister's community. Mercury was used in the process to bleach pulp for paper. Between 1962 and 1970, it dumped 10 tons of mercury, a potent neurotoxin, into the Wabigoon River. It's hard to grasp the magnitude of this pollution unless you're in the air. It flowed along here, silently decimating the water system, poisoning fish, from Dryden right to Grassy Narrows and beyond. 250 kilometers. These lakes, rivers, creeks. But no one knew any of that just yet.
We've already been told, like in the 50s, that there was something that was being discharged from upstream. But we saw it, we smelled it, we tasted it.
They didn't know it was mercury. One day, Grassy Narrows had a visitor.
There was a Métis guy that came from somewhere in Portage, and he said he brought a liquid which was silver. You know, it's like everybody played around with it because it was a liquid that was dry. And he told us that someday this thing is going to take away your life, your culture and tradition is being dumped upriver. He didn't use mercury, he called it quicksilver. You know, it's like, he told us it was very toxic.
No one knows how this mysterious visitor knew what was happening, but they took heed.
We had to get water from in the middle of the lake because the algae and everything else that came up from upstream was sort of contaminating the shorelines.
But what does that mean? What does mercury do? Okay, mercury is an element. It's the only metal that is liquid at room temperature. And we've known about the health hazards of mercury for a while. Ancient Roman miners of mercury would develop tremors, muscle spasms, and character disorders. You're probably also familiar with the expression mad as a hatter, because hat makers used to use mercuric nitrate to improve the felting quality of wool and fur. And from this exposure, they often suffered from tremors, manic depressive behavior, and temperamental instability. But what about mercury poisoning in recent times? Well, mercury was heavily used in the pulp and paper industry. Specifically, it's used to produce caustic soda and chlorine in the process of turning pulp into paper. And as a byproduct of this process, a lot of mercury is lost in wastewater and exhaust gases. And a lot of companies don't really care about where they dump this pollution, and that's when the health problems start happening. So apologies for this long and winding timeline, but we have to back up again, this time to the 1950s, and also we have to go to Japan. Minamata, Japan specifically, located on Kyushu Island on the bay of Shiranui Sea. At the time, in the 1950s, Minamata had a population of about 40,000 people, and its economy was mostly fishing and working at the Chiso Petrochemical Corporation. But in the 1950s, strange things started happening in Minamata. It started when fish would float to the surface of the bay, swim erratically, and thrash about wildly before dying. Then, a couple years after that, local cats started behaving oddly. In 1956, 2 people were diagnosed with cerebral palsy, but then more similar cases started popping up, suggesting that statistically, it probably wasn't all cerebral palsy. People called it Minamata disease. So what was happening? In 1956, a research team at Kumamoto University Medical School suspected that the strange nervous disease could be linked to heavy metal contamination in Minamata Bay, and more specifically, eating fish and shellfish from the bay. This hypothesis tracked, because Minamata disease seemed to affect mostly the poorest people in the community, who were the most dependent on eating fish and shellfish as part of their diet. From this hunch, it took years of research to pinpoint organic mercury as the cause of the disaster, and to provide conclusive evidence that the source of the poison was the effluent from the chemical plant of the Chiso Corporation.
It was in April of 1956 that the first case of a new disease was admitted to a factory hospital in Minamata, Japan, the Chiso Factory Hospital. By October of 56, it was known that the disease had been caused by eating fish which contained poisonous material. And that fish was from Minamata Bay. By mid-1957, 52 cases had been diagnosed and 21 people had died. By July of 1959, the specific poison was identified, methylmercury, and the medical symptoms and facts of the disease had been published in 1959. In 1962, the exact cause was pinpointed. It was mercury waste discharged from the Chiso factory in Minamata.
And from there, it took a full decade before the researchers could accumulate enough evidence to establish Chiso as legally liable for the damages caused by their pollution. So, to be specific, it wasn't specifically the inorganic mercury dumped as industrial waste that was making people sick, but it was its later production into methylmercury. So, inorganic or metallic mercury is dumped. It settles into the sediment of a body of water, and then microorganisms that live in the sediment, in order to protect themselves, convert the inorganic mercury into methylmercury, which is much less toxic to them, through a process called biomethylation. And methylmercury has one more carbon atom than the mercury atom, making it more readily absorbed by like a biological entity, so like living organisms. Transformed methylmercury is then absorbed by microscopic underwater life such as plankton or algae, which serve as food for insect larvae. Insects are consumed by little fish are consumed by bigger fish, and the burden of methylmercury in fish increases in concentration and toxicity as it passes up the food chain. So the higher up the food chain, the higher concentration of mercury an organism would have. So that's not great for humans who eat a lot of fish.
Wastewater containing inorganic mercury was released into the river system. In nature, inorganic mercury was converted by microbes into a more toxic compound, methylmercury, a form of organic mercury. Methylmercury enters the base of the food web by absorption into phytoplankton or algae and into zooplankton. Methylmercury is mainly transferred through the food web by dietary exposure or bioaccumulation. Plankton is eaten by aquatic insects and crustaceans. Aquatic insects and crustaceans are eaten by small fish. Larger fish consume these small fish, and the concentration of mercury becomes greater depending upon the size of the fish, its age, and the level it occupies in the food web. This is called biomagnification. Fish that eat other large fish, like northern pike and walleye, will have greater concentrations of mercury. When humans eat contaminated fish, mercury is absorbed into the bloodstream. In particular, methylmercury damages the central nervous system and the brain. It can also be transferred from a pregnant woman to the developing fetus.
I was pregnant with my youngest, the one, pardon?
When was that?
Back in 69 up till they banned commercial fishing. That's when my dad was commercial fishing on the English River system. And I think I ate the sturgeon without realizing, without thinking, without being educated that I had passed on the mercury to my boy.
Okay, and what about the health effects? Once the methylmercury is absorbed by the body, it's carried through the bloodstream and is concentrated into the body's tissues. It most notably impacts the brain, causing brain and nerve lesions. And methylmercury destroys cells in the cerebellum, which regulates balance, and also the cortex, which influences vision. And if it gets into the frontal lobe, it can cause disturbances in personality as well. Symptoms of mercury poisoning can be hard to trace back to the mercury because other disorders can also cause similar effects to the central nervous system. So things like alcoholism, diabetes, nutritional deficiencies, old age, and other disorders can also result in similar symptoms. So that's why people were being misdiagnosed with cerebral palsy at first in Minamata.
Matthew is a tourist fishing guide. Last month, Matthew was examined by Dr. Masazumi Harada, a neurologist, a psychiatrist, and the single man in the world with the most experience in the diagnosis of Minamata disease.
Look at this white target too, and don't move your eye. and this another white target moved. And when white target disappeared, you tell me. Yeah, she's sick.
Early symptoms of Minamata disease. Constriction of vision. We call it tunnel vision.
No. Yeah, you can.
Loss of hearing.
Yeah, no, you can hear. It is possible.
Tremor.
That you hear.
Impaired coordination.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Either weak or exaggerated reflex reaction.
I hold it.
Disturbance of the sense of balance.
Yes. Did pain? No.
Loss of feeling in the extremities.
Yes. All right. It is more pain. Up here. Huh? It is more pain. Up, yes.
Loss of feeling or numbness around the lips and mouth.
My head. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Same? What same? Same, yes.
Matthew, how long have you had that tremor in your hands?
A couple of years, I guess.
Mercury poisoning can eventually lead to severe disability, uncontrollable tremors and convulsions, deformity, paralysis, coma, and death. And once the poisoning has been taking effect, the disease is irreversible. So researchers in Minamata were able to find all this about human exposure to methylmercury, and they could trace its contamination back to the Chiso Corporation. But even then, Chiso Company executives refused to cooperate with scientists and continued to dump mercury into the bay until 1968. In the end, Chiso had to pay compensation to the victims of mercury poisoning, which by then numbered in the thousands, with over 100 dying as a result. One of the more upsetting impacts of methylmercury poisoning was how it severely affects unborn children. So mercury immediately passes from placenta to fetus, and the fetus actually concentrates the mercury, with blood concentrations in infants at birth averaging about 30% higher than the mother in Japan. So infants are born with what seems like cerebral palsy, deformed limbs, uncontrollable muscle spasms, and mental delays, and that's caused by underdeveloped and malformed nervous tissues. So at the time, in the 1970s in Canada, we knew, or should have known, the health impacts of mercury poisoning from eating contaminated fish, because these research studies had been conducted in Japan over a decade earlier. So sport fishing and tourism was banned in the Wabigoon River system, because the Fisheries Research Board of Canada found that there were extremely high levels of mercury in predatory fish from the Wabigoon River system, which tracks with the bioaccumulation of mercury theory, because predatory fish higher up on the food chain, for example walleye, northern pike, largemouth bass, and whitefish, are more likely to have higher levels of mercury. This hurt the Grassy Narrows area economically because a lot of people from the community were employed as fishing guides.
By 1970, fish from the English Wabigoon River system indicated levels of mercury more than 40 times the safety guideline. In the same year, the Ontario government banned commercial fishing. However, sports fishing continued under catch and release regulations.
In the 70s and 80s, I was guiding. Well, I started when I was 14.
Every day you eat fish?
When you guide, you eat fish every day.
And
I must eat about at least four fillets every meal, like every day. And
4 fillet in total for a day?
For the lunch, yeah.
Tom Strong was a guide and trapper who was known to be a frequent fish eater in Grassy Narrows. He died in 1972 at the age of 42. Bill Fobister wrote a letter to the Ontario government in 1972. We write to you and hope you will understand why we need more information on what eating too much fish may be doing to us. This may be very important to us and our children. According to the book Grassy Narrows by Hutchinson and Wallace, this letter influenced the Ontario government's decision to hold a coroner's inquest into Tom Strong's death. After conducting an autopsy, the Ontario government concluded Tom Strong died from acute coronary thrombosis resulting in a heart attack. A post-mortem blood sample taken from Mr. Strong showed a mercury level 11 times above the safety guideline. Dr. Stopes from the Ontario Health Ministry said the blood sample had probably been placed in a mercury-contaminated test tube. They denied mercury contributed to his death.
Then we went back sometimes. When I come home, I brought some fish home for my family too.
Marcel Papassé, a fishing guide in Grassy Narrows, also took fish home for his wife Rosie. In 1972, Rosie had a son, Keith Papassé. Dr. Betty Stevenson, acting health minister, said, Keith Papassé had not Minamata disease, but cerebral palsy. She never provided evidence of the mercury level in his blood at birth. In 1973, Health and Welfare Canada started experiments on cats, feeding them with fish from the same river system. 3 to 10 months later, the cats developed symptoms caused by mercury poisoning. Local residents were not informed of the experiments on cats.
One lodge in particular, the Ball Lake Lodge, owned by Barney and Marion Lamb, employed about 300 Grassy Narrows community members year-round. When the Lambs had to close the lodge, they filed a lawsuit against Dryden Chemical.
Area, the mercury value ranges from
The Japanese are in Grassy Narrows with the help of Maverick North Country airline boss Barney Lamb. He's been showing Japanese films on Minamata disease all over Canada. Barney is claiming some $3.7 million from the Dryden mill as compensation for a holiday camp he had to close 5 years ago because of the pollution danger to tourists. He spent over $150,000 of his own money in research and is running a one-man campaign to convince the government that the Indians are poisoned and that he has lost what would have been a very lucrative business.
I think the biggest thing is to convince the government and people that this is a serious situation, and this is what we are out to do. We have movies that we are showing. I think we'd like to convince news media that it is a serious situation, and I think this is the main point, is to...
They also hired Norvald Fimwright, a Norwegian graduate student at the University of Western Ontario, to study mercury levels in the area. In 1968, Norvald found that mercury levels downstream of the paper mill far exceeded international standards and were among the highest recorded in the Western Hemisphere. And around this time, residents of Grassy Narrows started showing symptoms similar to those seen in Minamata, Japan. In 1973, a study found that the Dryden pulp and paper mill had dumped at least 20,000 pounds of mercury into the Wabigoon River headwaters over a period from 1962 to 1970. And the estimates for the amount of mercury dumped varies a lot between sources, so definitely 20,000 pounds at the low end, and then at the high end I've seen estimates as high as 40,000 pounds. I watched a Fifth Estate episode from 1975. The Fifth Estate is a CBC-produced documentary series that's still going today. They do some great investigative journalism. And it was interesting to watch this one from 1970s because they talked about mercury poisoning. And also fun because the 70s were an interesting time. The poster that says fishing for fun and death. So at first, one of the most at-risk people for mercury poisoning seemed to be the fishing guides in the region. So as part of the experience, people would pay to have guides show them where to fish and how to fish. And to show that everything was safe, the guides were expected to eat shore lunches with the tourists every day. And a lot of lodges claim that they don't make people eat the fish, but you can see how a lot of guides don't feel comfortable refusing to do this. So anyway, people from Grassy Narrows were reporting a lot of the symptoms seen in Minamata. And in 1975, the Japanese research team that had made the connection between Minamata disease and mercury poisoning, led by Dr. Masazumi Harada, heard about the same mysterious illness being reported in a remote First Nations community in Canada, and they decided to study it. The research team flew into the community.
Dr. Masazumi Harada is a mercury poisoning specialist from Japan. He has been tracking the effects of mercury on human health for more than 50 years, including 30-year term studies of the residents in Grassy Narrows and White Dog.
Very long time we are follow-up study. There is no such a case in the world.
Oh, really?
Yes.
In Minamata, there were many severe cases already appearing when the poisoning came to the attention of local health authorities. The first official discovery of Minamata disease occurred in 1956, but what were the patient's conditions 10 years before they became severe? The opportunity to study that was gone in Japan. The mercury poisoning in Canada could provide that understanding. In order to see what the early stages of Minamata disease were like, I had to go outside Japan.
And not only were they interested in helping people, but they also wanted to see the effects of mercury poisoning in its more early stages, which they hadn't in Minamata, because by the time the researchers were able to figure out what was going on, the nervous system deterioration had progressed a lot. But in Canada, the effects of the disease were just beginning to be reported.
When Dr. Harada first visited Grassy Narrows and White Dog in 1975, he examined 89 residents and found atypical symptoms. Although he recorded the same symptoms among residents in both communities, no one had all of the typical symptoms of the Hunter-Russell syndrome. All the symptoms were mild. In 2002, Dr. Harada and Dr. Fujino conducted clinical neurological examinations on 57 residents of Grassy Narrows. Although none of the residents were defined as at risk, 45 residents showed symptoms of mercury poisoning, nearly 80% of the total examinees.
It's everyone in Grassy Narrows, from the oldest to the youngest.
I've been coming to Grassy Narrows for approximately 15 years, every 1 or 2 weeks, and it's very difficult to differentiate between when you see a patient as to what's causing some of their deficits, especially if they have neurologic deficits, as to whether or not it's alcohol-related, diabetes-related, other substances, or perhaps mercury problems. Certainly over the years we've had a good relationship with some of the specialists in Winnipeg, i.e. some of the neurologists in Winnipeg who are helping to follow patients with mercury poisoning here.
My feet, feel numb for the last 3 years. I don't know what causes that.
Some guys get sick on it, And I guess everybody's going to get it if you don't look after it.
A very large proportion of these people have one or have symptoms and signs in one or two of the 4 fields which are characteristic of mercury poisoning.
So we can hear from these radio interviews from 1975 that a large portion of the community is reporting symptoms, and the government's response to this was just to tell people to fish elsewhere. And then we get into some of the BS of this story, the part where the federal government and the provincial government and the industry pass around the blame like a hot potato. Ministers of different portfolios representing different interests contradicted each other publicly. So the Minister of Health advised, don't eat the fish, but the Minister of Natural Resources said it was fine for tourists to come up and eat the fish. And a Grassy Narrows resident explained that in 1970, government people just came to the community and told everyone to stop fishing, but they didn't bother explaining why or what mercury was or how people got sick from it. So based on this really vague demand to stop fishing, it justifiably caused a suspicion in the community that this was just a government ruse to take away fishing rights. Oh, and I read another story about the Ministry of Health procuring a blood sample from someone who had been a heavy fish eater and who had died presumably from mercury poisoning. He was showing all the symptoms. And even though this blood sample showed extremely high levels of mercury, the Ministry of Health worker said that the blood sample had probably been contaminated by mercury in the lab. So imagine you are a citizen going through all of this. Would you not be confused as hell, wondering if you could eat fish or not, and wondering what the hell was going on? Robert Billingsley was some bigwig at Dryden Chemical at the time. Here's an interview where he tries to waffle around where the blame lies, and he also says something stupid about headaches.
I think they put it this way, that they found many symptoms that are symptomatic of Minamata disease. They did not come out and say, in any case, that was Minamata disease. And in fact, it was pointed out that in almost any sample, you would find perhaps 5% of the population of Toronto that would show symptoms of Minamata disease. Headaches, for example, is a symptom.
So apologies for the outdated language and attitudes in some of these clips. They are from almost 50 years ago. Oh, and here's another one where Ontario politicians are being kind of racist about Japanese researchers.
The Japanese have worked for 30 years on Minamata disease, but few Canadian doctors, scientists and government officials believe they're right about the new Indian cases. Local Kenora MP is Leo Bernier, who's also Ontario's Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Bernier says the government won't act until Canada, not Japan, has conclusive proof that the Indians are severely affected.
I would hope that, from the information we've got to date, that there are no real damages to the Indian people in the Grassy and White Dog areas. This has been our information. The federal people have verified this. They are responsible, as you know, for the health of Indians on federal Indian reserves. Until some expert or somebody certainly qualified in the health profession that would relate that information, to the Ontario government, then I have to accept what's been told us to date. I don't think that we can rely on, some traveling Japanese troubadours coming through and visiting these reserves on a 1 or 2 day basis and coming up with those kind of findings. I think they have to be long and detailed and well researched.
Troubadours? I don't know this word.
It's a song and dance act.
Aha, I see. If he visits Japan to see the situation, we are very glad to invite him to Minamata and Niigata. I suppose he doesn't know the actual situation of Minamata disease in Japan.
Essentially, executives at Dryden Chemical kept trying to say that mercury occurs naturally in the environment, but the Ontario government ended up concluding that the company was the major source of pollution in the river system. But still, Dryden Chemical continued to deny any liability throughout the 1970s. The company claimed that they had a license to pollute from the Ontario government, and they had respected existing environmental regulations and standards, and therefore could not be held exclusively liable. However, the Ontario provincial government ordered the Dryden Chemical Company to stop dumping mercury into the river. Since this ordinance only mentioned direct dumping into the river, airborne mercury emissions continued until 1975. And then the pulp and paper mill closed in 1976. Dr. Masazumi Harada's research team from Kumamoto University started their longitudinal health study on Grassy Narrows residents in 1975. So longitudinal studies, that just means they take place over time. So this would be kind of like the first cohort, and then he would plan to go back over the years and measure more. And the researchers found through analyzing hair samples that 87 Grassy Narrows residents were over the safe limit of 100 parts per million of mercury, with 61 samples in the 100 to 199 range and 26 exceeding 200 parts per million.
On November 13, 1971, Shimichi Shimada, the president of Chiso Corporation, met with Minamata disease victims in Minamata, and he accepted moral responsibility. But the piece of paper he signed for the patients that day carefully excluded legal responsibility. On March 20, 1973, Judge Jiro Sato said that when lives were at stake, it wasn't good enough to live within the letter of the law. I think you might like to hear part of his judgment. In the final analysis, no plant can be permitted to infringe on and run at the sacrifice of the lives and the health of the regional residents. The defendant's plant discharged acetaldehyde wastewater with negligence at all times. And even though the quality and the content of the wastewater of the defendant's plant satisfied statutory limitations and administrative standards, and even if the treatment methods it employed were superior to those taken at the workyards of other companies in the same industry, these are not enough to upset the said assumption. The defendant cannot escape from the liability of negligence. And the liability is considerable. Chiso has already paid out over $86 million in compensation, average payments of over $60,000 to each victim of Minamata disease. And Minamata Bay is being cleaned up. The Wabagoon English River system will continue to carry and exude its burden of poisonous methylmercury for 80 to 100 years. That's 4 or 5 generations before fishing in this water system will be safe for the residents of Grassy Narrows and White Dog, for the tourists and fishermen who are the guests of the many hunting and fishing lodges in the area. And despite all of that, no one in Ontario so far says very much about compensation.
So a lot of this kind of mirrors what happened in Japan with the Chiso Corporation, i.e. shifting blame. And here's a pretty shocking interview with one of the fishing lodge owners in the Grassy Narrows area, Molly Honstein.
Well, I just feel, with these guys, they lose their equilibrium. They're always drunk. They've been killing their kids before mercury was ever found here. Cats starving to death. Kids with bloated stomachs. So don't blame it on the mercury.
So what do you blame it on?
You mean the Indians drinking? They've always been like that. Do you have Indians in Toronto? They can't drink. None of them can.
Fuck you. So I guess before the outright government ban on sport fishing, some of the lodges, like the Lambs, closed voluntarily, rather than exposing everyone to mercury poisoning. And others, like Molly Honstein, kept their lodges open and exposed their customers and their employees to mercury poisoning. As you can imagine, both the effects of mercury poisoning and the loss of jobs from the sport fishing and tourism industry closing down had a pretty devastating impact on the community of Grassy Narrows.
It will take up to 20 years for the conclusive effects of mercury poisoning at Grassy Narrows to become clear. But while the medical controversy rages across the Pacific, the Indians have major problems that need urgent attention. They can't eat the only food they've ever known, fish. There's no work. Because of the mercury poisoning, there are no regular jobs in the camps or as guides. The result? Heavy drinking and a feeling of great despair and apathy. But leader Tom Kisik is determined to fight.
I'm angry at the whole Canadian government policy. I think they should start working on a solution policy rather than the popsicle policy they've been handing down the native people here. We're not looking for sympathy from the government. The government had given the plant some $3.5 million to continue its operation. They have already received a lot of government aid to make profits.
How much have you got?
We've got nothing, period.
The documentary Scars of Mercury, which came out in 2010, interviews a few people sport fishing in the area.
Do you think so?
Oh no, we've been eating them.
You've been eating them?
Yeah.
They taste good.
Yeah.
fact, past
But
couple
do you
days.
know what happened in this area about 25 years ago? 30 years ago. The chemical, not the paper mill in Dryden discharged mercury in the
Really?
English Barbican River system, and
Really?
it contaminated the whole fish. That
Wow.
was 30 years ago. So I'm not
Yeah,
sure
but
how
I've been
safe
eating
it
them
is
for
now.
like 6 years, and I
safe.
haven't got sick or nothing yet.
So you've been coming here for 6 years.
Well, I've been coming here for 4, but my dad brought them home since like a long time ago.
Then you eat fish.
Oh yeah.
From here.
Yep.
The Ontario Ministry of the Environment publishes a guide to eating sports fish. In the guide, there is information about the contamination of fish. Mercury is the first contaminant to be mentioned. The fish consumption tables indicate eating limits dependent upon the contamination level of each lake.
Why do you release it?
Just fun to catch. Not big enough really to eat. So
if it's bigger, then you'll eat it?
probably, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
I see.
Eat them all. Go out there, catch lots of them, eat them.
Uh-huh. Oh.
Good food.
This is where I want to go back to Dr. Skelnick's book, A Poison Stronger Than Love. And she has some really interesting information here, both in terms of statistics and testimonies. I'm going to add in an extra trigger warning here for violence and some really tough subject matter. She notes that from 1959 to 1963, before Grassy Narrows was relocated and before Dryden Chemicals started contaminating the environment with mercury, 91% of all deaths in the community were due to natural causes, so like old age, illness, or accidents. However, by the mid-1970s, far fewer deaths could be attributed to these things. From 1974 to 1978, 75% of all deaths at Grassy Narrows were due to alcohol or drug-induced violence directed at others or self-inflicted. 75%. At this point in the book, Skelnick lists all the deaths from these 4 years. Remember, at the time, the community was around 500 people, I think, and it's a very rough read. It lists names, ages of people, and causes of death, and a lot of them are very violent deaths involving alcohol, like drowning, fire, assault, or railway impact. The book also documents attempted suicides from 1977 to 1978, a time period where 26 people from the ages of 11 to 19 tried to take their own lives, representing almost 1/5 of the entire population of this age group. And note that these are only the attempts that came to the attention of the Grassy Narrows police. I would suspect that there are probably many other incidents that were not reported. So from these statistics, we can clearly see a community in crisis at this time. Skelnick describes widespread alcohol abuse, battered women, abandoned children, and just a sense of demoralization everywhere. What struck me about Grassy Narrows was the numbness in the human spirit. There was an indifference, a listlessness, a total passivity that I could neither understand nor seem to do anything about. She describes how it was really common for kids to just kind of roam around the community because it wasn't safe to go home where everyone was drinking heavily. And she describes how the kids would essentially just wait until all the adults had drank themselves unconscious, and then they would be able to go back home. So people would basically get into a pattern where you would drink until everything was gone or until you had the money to buy more. Dr. Skelnick worked as a community planner, so she tried to implement some community improvements. She applied for federal and provincial funding, and she tried to kickstart a few programs to help the economy. So one of them was a community-based wild rice industry. But even as she noted that community income and employment improved in Grassy Narrows, there still was just suffering everywhere. and a level of suffering that was unique to Grassy Narrows, more so than the other First Nations communities in that area of northwestern Ontario. One thing that Grassy Narrows went through that most other communities in the region didn't was mercury poisoning, and Shkelnik ultimately attributed the violence and demoralization in the community to this. A not uncommon reaction in those who have been touched by violent death is to repress grief, guilt, or anger until those powerful emotions can be released by the disinhibiting effects of alcohol. People forgive each other for acts of violence committed under the influence of alcohol because they say, the pain has to come out sometime. So, not being able to eat fish might sound like not as big a deal as it actually is, but in the community when it's already hard to get food, where fish is and has been culturally important food for thousands of years, and when there's already a lot of intergenerational trauma from the impacts of colonialism, it can be the final straw.
Walleye is not safe.
Yes.
And you still...
It's so hard to... It's so hard to not eat this walleye.
How come?
Because it's so tasty, and it's like it's the thing that we were eating from the time that I was old enough to eat. How can you put away the stuff that you've had growing up? But what we try to do more so though, we don't eat as much of walleye now. I hear some of our people saying, no, walleye, well, if I want to eat a walleye, I'm not going to eat it under the river system, that water that's polluted, like Wabagoon English River. If I'm going to eat a walleye, I'm going to go out to a different lake. For example, Slant Lake, that's not a lake that comes from the river system. So it would be, in the way we think, it would be safe.
My whole life I've ate fish. It's a part of my culture. It's a part of my tradition. It's not just food. It's a part of our spirituality. And because of the mercury contamination, it has affected our whole way of life as a people.
The problem started when they lost their trapping, fishing, their old way of life. Huh?
I haven't even gone into the impact of residential schools, a legacy which touched Grassy Narrows, where children were taken from their communities and sent to government-financed schools administered by Christian churches, where abuse was rampant in many different ways. So keep all that trauma in mind when we're looking at these things here. So trigger warning for child abuse in these clips.
So nobody knew that the Mounties were coming when they came and took you away?
No, they usually showed up 3, 4 o'clock in the morning.
Really?
While everyone was sleeping.
Really?
Yeah.
Don Billard listened as Robert spoke about his residential school experience. The closest residential school was located in McIntosh, 35 kilometers southeast of Grassy Narrows. It was in operation from the 1920s to the 1960s.
How many kids did they pick up?
There's about 4 of us, 4 each time, or sometimes no more than 4. They plane and they just take 4 each time.
What did the parents say about that?
They couldn't say nothing. My parents tried to hold me back, and the Mountie said, if you don't let them go, we'll put you in lockup.
They told that to your parents? Yeah. How old were you?
I was 6 years old.
Yeah? Oh. How long were you in residential school for?
About 5, 6 years.
Yeah? Oh. Who ran the residential school? Who were your teachers? Were they
the nuns and priests.
Oh, Roman Catholic, eh?
Catholics, yeah.
Was there punishments for if you spoke Anishinaabe?
Yeah, we weren't allowed to talk native at all.
Oh.
Yeah. And they called us savages.
Really?
Yeah.
What kind of punishment did they have?
All kinds of it, mostly strap. They had the big strap and with, what do you call it, rivets?
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, and they slap you across your back, your hands.
Yeah.
You never hit me on the face though. There was one kid, his name was Joseph Spence. He died from beating.
Yeah? So they beat him to death?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I don't know how they did it, but they used a strap and something else, I guess. Yeah.
They got away with that?
Huh?
They got away with it?
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Nobody said nothing. Yeah.
Yeah.
This kid was 11 years old. They made us go look at the body.
Really?
The little boy was pretty, you know, he was white.
Yeah.
And he said, this is how we're going to look when you die. Pretty, you know.
Oh,
They
yeah,
make it feel like we should want to die.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, because he was all white?
Yeah, white.
And
yeah.
they said that's what...
Yeah, you're going to look pretty when you die.
Oh.
White mean pale?
Yeah, pale.
White?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They put some stuff on his face to make it look more prettier. Yeah.
Is this the way of them saying that your skin color is not right?
No, they wanted us to think we should die. We'd be better off dead, I guess. Something like that. Yeah. But that's... I don't like to think about it at all.
While there's no way to measure with any precision how much the current crisis at Grassy Narrows is attributable to mercury and how much is to a collapse of a way of life, the people's own perception of the importance of mercury is significant. They speak of mercury poisoning as the event that pushed them over the edge of their ability to feel secure in nature and relate to each other and to the world around them, and to be self-reliant in providing for their material needs. They call mercury the last nail in the coffin. So, what's next? The Anti-Mercury Ojibwe Group formed in 1975, and they prepared for legal action regarding mercury poisoning. There was also another related report released in 1979 called The Economic and Social Impact of Mercury Pollution on the White Dog and Grassy Narrows Indian Reserves, Ontario. I also found a few other reports released in the 1970s from different Canadian health research entities about the health impacts of mercury poisoning in the area. But we didn't really see anything resembling accountability until the 1980s. So this part was a bit confusing to put together, so essentially I'm just going to go through a timeline of documents that I found. And essentially the government gave Grassy Narrows some money, but they didn't clean up the mercury or indicate any plan of doing so in the future. So in 1982, the Canadian federal government gave $2.2 million to Grassy Narrows for economic development, social, and educational programs. And in 1983, the Ontario government also gave $4.4 million of settlement money to the community for similar reasons. White Dog also got some money from the federal and provincial governments as a part of this settlement. And in 1984, the environment minister at the time said that the river was cleaning itself and that there was no need for government intervention.
Here's Winnipeg activist and filmmaker Thor Aikenhead in the documentary Scars of Mercury.
When I think about the mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows and White Dog and how it could have started, I think about when was the mill built, how was it constructed. I mean, there was an outflow pipe that was designed to go into that structure, the Dryden chemicals plant, and I think we've known that mercury has been poisonous for more than 100 years. So they knew where it was going, and they didn't really care.
For 16 years, people awaited justice, many crippled by blindness, tremors, speech impairments. After nearly 20 years, the Canadian government and the Ontario government, along with those who owns the pulp and paper mill, ponied up $16 million for the people of Grassy Narrows and those further downstream at White Dog who were mercury poisoned. Once the ink was dry on the settlement, everyone seemed to wash their hands of the matter. The pulp and paper mill was bought and sold numerous times. It remains one of Dryden's economic engines even today. Government scientists said that the river system over time would cleanse itself of this poison. In the meantime, though, no one was to eat the fish.
We lost our fishing, we couldn't eat off the land anymore the way we used to. It was poison.
Don't eat the fish was all the help they got. And the disability settlement was rationed out by a board that determined who got money and how much.
Open your mouth.
Scars of Mercury cataloged the many visits Japanese researchers made to Grassy Narrows and White Dog in the decades that followed. Here's Steve Fobister being examined.
In 1985, the Government of Ontario granted the Dryden Mill and any future owners indemnity, assuming all environmental liabilities related to the mill and its mercury dumping.
What the fuck?
And then, in 1986, there was a Royal Commission on the Northern Environment, which contained some discussion and environmental impact analysis on development in northwestern Ontario. The Commission report concluded that the northern environment, the people who live there, and their communities are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of large-scale resource development, and these northern populations do not have the capacity to influence the course of development. The Commission did also mention mercury contamination specifically, albeit rather briefly, and they at least acknowledged that the Dryden paper mill was the source of this contamination, which seems like common sense now, but it's good that they admitted this on paper. The Commission recommended that until the claims of White Dog and Grassy Narrows are settled, the Government of Ontario should not grant any cutting rights to the Great Lakes Forest Products Limited or any subsequent owner of the Dryden Mill complex in forest land outside existing company management units. So I'm always surprised at the language used in documents like this, where there was some kind of investigation. It's always so wishy-washy, and I guess I get it to an extent, but this recommendation just seems kind of weak. And note that all it is a recommendation, so, can't the government just decide, okay, no thanks? Anyway, back to the Mercury Contamination Settlement Fund. So that was the money granted by the government to both Grassy Narrows and White Dog First Nations as a result of the mercury contamination. In 1986, an agreement was established on how to distribute the money from the settlement fund to people affected by mercury poisoning. And as you can imagine, there is a lot of tomfuckery that went along with this.
It's just not right. It's really eerie here. Something's fucky.
So there's a board in charge of approving and distributing the funding to people, and you have to submit a claim of being affected by mercury in order to receive any funding. So it doesn't just go out to everybody.
The gap between the Canadian and Japanese criteria for determining who is mercury poisoned is just one frustration facing the people of the English Wabigoon River system. Remember that settlement fund? Well, there's problems with how much money is even left, and the board that manages it has come under fire for how many people they aren't helping.
That's frustration for the community. As I am too, I'm frustrated.
This is Steve Fobister Sr. He's only 64. Aged by mercury poisoning, which devastates the nervous system of its victims. A pulp and paper mill dumped 10 tons of the neurotoxin upstream from his home on the Grassy Narrows First Nation during the 1960s. They live on fish. Fish that for 50 years has been crippling them. Killing them. In 1986, the federal and provincial governments and the companies that owned the polluting Dryden paper mill came up with a $16 million settlement for Grassy Narrows and White Dog, a community further downstream that had also been affected.
Important to note, they never did divide it up in the first place. If they would have received approximately $14,000 each if they had done it that way.
Instead, a Mercury Disability Board was established to manage the money and determine who gets it, anywhere from $250 to $800 a month, less than welfare, for having your life stolen, if you even get compensation. Gabe Fobister was Grassy's representative on the Mercury Disability Board.
Very seldom some people get it, eh?
Yeah.
And some just more frustrated, why they don't get awarded.
Only 314 people have ever received benefits. Currently, just 191 people get compensation. 70% of the people who apply are denied.
A lot of those folks have suffered and died with very little recognition, never mind compensation.
Disability Board Chairman Margaret Wanlon defends the stats.
So people have to have issues that are related to the neurological system in order to get a benefit. And the statistics to date are that about 30% of the people who apply have those symptoms.
The symptoms, most of them I think they ignore because they found out this client has diabetes. Well, that's what causing poor vision and numbness, on the hand and nerve damage. That's the thing that, to me, it's unfair. See, if you get Japanese experts, they would all say, that's a symptom of mercury.
So is the criteria they're using wrong, out of date?
Unfortunately, the world's knowledge of mercury has not progressed much past what it was in the late 80s when this was set up.
But new science has come out since she made that claim.
We visited 2 communities. We found that more than 90% of the population in these communities have sensory disturbance.
That means a whole other generation is affected with neurological problems and, in theory, should be compensated.
So these studies confirm that what we've known all along, that we've been poisoned and we've had symptoms of mercury poisoning.
So just like a health insurance company, it generally seemed that the Mercury Settlement Funding Board tried to find any excuse to deny a funding claim, which was assisted by the fact that a lot of mercury poisoning symptoms can be attributed to other common ailments experienced by Grassy Narrows community members, so for example, diabetes. Oh, and then there's this one interview that blew my mind.
Adding insult to injury, he was cut off of Mercury disability pay when he received a settlement for the abuses he suffered at residential school.
So they cut off his Mercury disability settlement when he received another settlement for the abuse that he suffered at residential school. The Canadian government, where they can traumatize you in as many ways as they like, but you can only pick one settlement fund. In 2004, Dr. Masazumi Harada followed up on his 1975 study by traveling back to Grassy Narrows and testing hair samples of residents again, decades later. He found that all of the people who had tested over the mercury limit in 1975 had passed away. He also found that residents were still showing signs of mercury poisoning decades after the paper mill had stopped operating. And I have to say, in the research that I did, which included sources from across decades from the 1970s onward, it was really cool to see Dr. Harada and his team just kind of popping up consistently. And the talk about their studies and revisiting the community every so often to take samples. It's just really cool to see how he has built relationships with community members over many decades.
My mother used to say a long time ago, whenever there would be any really catastrophe that was in the movies or or on the air, she would say, always look for the helpers. There will always be helpers.
So anyway, like Mr. Rogers said, remember to look for the helpers.
Steve Fobister dropped by to welcome the research team. Dr. Kazuhito Tsuruta noticed his speech impairment.
The sensation I examine, you're feeling.
I found a very special type of sensory disturbance in mercury-contaminated areas. This symptom is rarely caused by other diseases.
What Dr. Harada mentioned is that sensory disturbances increase near the tips of the toes, fingers, and around the mouth.
More clear, down.
Through our control studies in Japan, we could not find this type of sensory disturbance in non-contaminated areas at all. It is a typical symptom caused by methylmercury poisoning.
In short, comparing contaminated areas with non-contaminated areas, the pattern rather than the frequency of sensory disturbance is characteristic.
Hair samples were also taken to be tested for mercury levels when the doctors and the research team returned to Japan.
Thank you.
Whenever methylmercury passes through the body, it particularly damages the nervous system, brain, and some organs. This is when mercury levels are high in the body. After methylmercury slowly leaves the body, the mercury level decreases, but that doesn't mean the person is better. The nervous system and the brain remain damaged, and it is irreversible.
In 2014, 90% of Grassy Narrows residents, including newborns, had symptoms of mercury poisoning. But if you recall, the Dryden pulp and paper mill closed in 1976. So why are we seeing continued mercury poisoning long after the paper mill had been operational? Now remember the estimates of 20,000 to 40,000 pounds of mercury being dumped into the Wabigoon River system? This is inorganic mercury, not methylmercury. The glacial clay in the lake near Grassy Narrows, called Clay Lake, tended to accumulate the inorganic mercury in its sediment quite readily. And once this inorganic mercury has been added to a water system, it takes a very long time for the mercury to clear the marine biosystem. Scientists estimate that only about 1% of the sediment's burden of inorganic mercury is converted into methylmercury each year, and the biological half-life of methylmercury in fish is very long, with the process of contamination being continuous and persistent. Not only is the contaminated lake settlements continuously converting and releasing methylmercury into the river system decades after the Dryden mill has stopped dumping inorganic mercury, the methylmercury continues to impact the human brain cells long after someone has stopped eating contaminated food. Methylmercury has a biological half-life of at least 70 days in human blood, and maybe even longer in the brain. This means that after 70 days, half the burden of methylmercury still exists in the body. And each 70 days after that, the burden is reduced by half again. Individual people also have different tolerances to mercury, and damage might not be seen for years after exposure. And as we saw before, it can be difficult to make an early diagnosis because early mercury poisoning symptoms can be confused with other things. In July of 2015, a then 65-year-old Alberta man wrote to the chief of Grassy Narrows, saying that in 1972, when he was 21 years old, he had worked for the Dryden paper mill, and as part of his job, he recalled shoveling mercury into drums. He said that he and others in a small crew had dumped approximately 50 drums containing liquid mercury and salt, which was industrial waste from the mill, into a large pit upstream of Grassy Narrows. So some scientists believe that these supposedly buried barrels of mercury might explain why community members, including newborns, have symptoms of mercury poisoning decades after the initial dumping of mercury into the waterways. The Ministry of the Environment undertook geophysical testing following the report, but they didn't find any barrels. In 2016, a report from an environmental consulting firm was leaked revealing that Ontario provincial authorities had known for decades that the site of the old Dryden pulp and paper mill was contaminated with mercury, that it could be cleaned up safely, but that no efforts had been made to do so. Grand Chief Bill Fobister then led a march with 1,000 protesters in downtown Toronto, demanding cleanup of mercury poisoning. In 2017, 2 Ontario politicians, or as some community members put it, 2 guys from Toronto, came up to Grassy Narrows to discuss cleaning up the water system. There are several remediation options that have been suggested by experts to clean up mercury in the river system, depending on the source of where the mercury is coming from. So if the mercury is coming from the groundwater, the scientists suggest using a pump and treat remediation technique where water is captured in wells before it can reach the river and then sent on for treatment. If the mercury is sourced from the sediment eroding from the mill site, they recommend removing the contaminated sediment as the solution. And this might seem drastic, but researchers are concerned that a disturbance in this sediment that contains mercury might redistribute it in the ecosystem fairly rapidly, suggesting that cleaning up the sediment might be inevitable in the future if there's the potential for like a bunch of it to release at once.
The science community has joined the fight by sounding alarms. North Carolina biologist Patricia Sellers has been studying mercury's effects on the water in the English Wabigoon system for a decade.
First of all, that mercury is still high in the sediment in some basins and higher than, guidelines suggest it should be. And secondly, that it's probably on the move, that it's actually distributing itself now further downstream.
She suggests adding clean sediment to areas where sediment is particularly polluted.
That clean sediment will cover the contaminated sediment. And if you cap the contaminated sediment, you deny the opportunity of this sediment from interacting with the food web.
3 renowned scientists has found that Grassy Narrows Wabigoon River can indeed be cleaned up, and the fish can indeed become safe again to eat. But this will only happen if there is political will from Premier Wynne and her government.
Many see this Ontario government, this moment in history, as the last chance for justice, for reconciliation.
Historically, pipe is very sacred to us.
Mercury victim and longtime justice warrior Judy De Silva presented a pipe to Zimmer when he was at Grassy Narrows, a gift from an elder.
He would like you to keep this, and it's already loaded, and when the river is clean and it's finished and done, and then you smoke the pipe.
When the song and dance was done, some weren't willing to let yet another government pack up and leave without a parting word.
I just wanted to say that now that you have that pipe, that you're promising that he's going to have clean water.
Yes. It's a beautiful little thing. We bring this back for you. Yes, thank you.
From 2013 to 2020, the community of Grassy Narrows was under a drinking water advisory due to a need for upgrades at the local water treatment plant.
This is our Grassy Narrows First Nations standpipe. This is the water that gives pressure and delivers water to the community members. The water in there is not safe.
When we found out the mercury was in the water, it had a really devastating effect in our community, economically, socially, and all that. It's like a genocide of our people. A lot of our people have died from the mercury poisoning, and still today they are.
We have a water place in our reserve. They give out water to each and one of us, a water jug. But if we run out, it's a disaster. Like, we don't have a date.
So when the water guy brings water, we have all our empties that we're collecting, so we trade full water jugs for our empty jugs, and that's how we get our water. We're actually buying it from Kenora.
The poor people, they are very desperate when they run out of water because they can't afford to go into town to get water. I could see it in them today when they're coming to get the water, how desperate they were, like there's no water.
We should be drinking from our taps, not the water jugs. That's not normal.
So here, these are our filters. This is our baffles. At this moment, our water system is sending out some chemical in our treated water due to the lack of upgrades we need here.
In October 2020, Grassy Narrows ended its drinking water advisory because upgrades were completed to its water treatment system. The system was deemed good enough to provide the community with clean and safe drinking water. And that's great, and it makes a big difference in the community. They don't have to count on water being shipped in, worry about it running out, or having to buy water from the store. But number one, why did it take so long to upgrade the water treatment? If you recall, Walkerton, it only took a matter of weeks to get that sorted out. I think about that baby in the video where she makes the politician promise to make sure the water is safe for him. But the water in the river isn't safe yet. In fact, it seems to be worse. Just because the community has a water treatment plant, we kind of expect all Canadians to have access to safe drinking water through water treatment plants at this point, so it's kind of a given. And even though these treatment facilities are in place, there haven't been any updates on the larger scale mercury remediation plan from the government since 2017. The government did promise to build a mercury care home in Grassy Narrows to provide clinical services to people suffering from mercury poisoning, but construction on that was supposed to happen this summer, and I don't think it has yet. And in May of 2024, just earlier this year, a research team led by Western biology professor Brian Brandfiren detected heightened levels of methylmercury in the English Wabigoon River system. The research discovered that the combination of sulfate and organic matter from the mill was actually elevating the creation of the more toxic methylmercury in the river. In other words, the mill was adding the other necessary ingredients to form methylmercury. Federal Indigenous Service Minister Patty Hadju said that the matter falls under Ontario jurisdiction. Dryden Fibre Canada, owner of the Dryden paper mill, wouldn't comment on it. So, why are we playing hot potato again? It's possible to remove methylmercury from the water, but it won't be easy, and it will take substantial time and resources. In the meantime, we still have young people having serious symptoms and dying from mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows. I found a recent article in which a grandfather from Grassy Narrows discusses the effects of mercury poisoning on two of his grandchildren. It's the youngsters Phobister worries about the most. Two of his grandchildren, Darwin and Catherine, are severely affected by symptoms associated with mercury poisoning. Darwin has difficulty with his balance and often has the sensation that he's going to fall forward. He also has problems with memory and concentration and suffers from extreme headaches. They're never going to grow up normal, Phobister said. They have to go to appointments in Winnipeg with a neurologist just about every month. We struggle to make those appointments. There's no help. Medical services only covers a fraction of the travel. I wanted to end off with that article to show how the community is still being severely impacted by this. Young people are being poisoned by mercury still, and there is new research to show that the mercury levels in the water and the fish in Grassy Narrows are not slowing down. The mercury burden seems to be very high in the environment still. and we don't really know the exact reason why. But we could probably figure this out with continued research. Scientists have already said that they think cleanup is possible. We just need to invest the time and money into doing this. And unfortunately, it seems like cleanup efforts in Grassy Narrows are just not happening. Back in 2017, the Liberal Ontario government pledged $85 million to clean up Grassy Narrows. But this was back when the Liberal government was in power, and it seems like the Conservative government did not follow through with this funding pledge since they've taken power since 2018. Thanks, Doug. And it seems like not much has been done in terms of remediation of the area at all. And I don't really know what to do. It would seem like a good place in the video to make a call to action, but I'm kind of at a loss. You could sign one of the handful of petitions that are out there, which I would still encourage you to do if you're so inclined. And if you're in Ontario, you could write to your local MPP about this. And I'm trying not to be pessimistic, but they'll probably either ignore you or give you some kind of canned response of word vomit, and then it would just make you more mad. But you should still do it, because we have to work within the confines of this system. If you're elsewhere in Canada, you could write to Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada and tell them that this should still be in their domain, even though they're trying to pass the buck off to the provincial government, because, you know, we are all treaty people. And if you're not in Canada, I don't know, you could just call Doug Ford if you want. You used to be able to just call his personal cell phone. He would just give it out to people. Unfortunately, he doesn't give out that number anymore, but I reiterate that that is something that he used to do as an attempt to appear approachable and of the people. Shockingly, he had to stop doing this in 2019 because as the premier, he was getting a lot of phone calls from people. But you can still call his office and stuff. And yeah, if you've made it this far, thanks a bunch. I really appreciate everyone who watches these, and especially when people leave nice comments. I'm always floored by the kindness and the thoughtfulness in the comment section. I guess because it's the internet, I'm just prepared for the worst, so it's been really great so far. And it's nice to know that something that I've pulled together has had some meaning for people. That's just great.
My emotions! My emotions!
And if you'd like to see more about this type of social justice-y, Canadian-y centered content, leave a like and subscribe. That would always be appreciated. I'm going to try and get out videos more often now. I know there has been a bit of a gap since the last video. I've been going through some pretty heavy stuff.
Well, when life gives you lemons.
But things are getting better. And my dog is awesome, and she's a big light in my life right now. Her name is Molly. And it's currently super late at night while I'm finishing this, and Molly is trying to sleep beside me, but she keeps huffing impatiently beside me because I'm still recording and talking and keeping her up. And another light in my life is making these videos, so I look forward to doing this more often. Oh, and if you can think of any type of content or topics that you'd like to see, I'd love to hear from you, so let me know in the comment section. Okay, I think that's everything, so take care, and I will see you next time.